Hmm.
So welcome everyone who's here to our first live Ask the Experts Weekly California Cannabis AMA. I'm Maria from Kaipush, and I know I'm really excited to learn from John, as I hope the rest of you are. So whether you're kind of a seasoned pro in the industry or just getting started, I'm sure everyone's really eager to jump into some insightful conversations. Um, John is a seasoned cannabis lawyer, and we're really grateful that he's taken the time to answer some of your questions. So here's kind of how everything will work. Basically, you have questions and John has answers. So whether you're curious about compliance or you just want some general advice, now is your chance to pick his brain for free. So just drop your questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom there, and we'll do our best to get to as many of them as possible. So I'll just hand things over to John, and he'll just kind of introduce himself, and then we'll jump right into the questions.
Yeah, thank you, Maria, so much, and thank you for creating the platform and opportunity for me to help people with what questions they may have. I'll give a quick background to just give some context about some of my experience, and then, as you know, we can get started. Um, Technical things first, as a lawyer, just making sure that I say the right disclosures. Although I'm open to talking about different things and giving some feedback, there's no client relationship until actually retained, and anything on here is not specific legal advice to any specific problem, but more general feedback and thoughts and sort of consideration about my experience and other things. So if anybody is interested in getting more formal legal opinions or advice, we would have to sign an engagement. Other than that, started on the East Coast, doing cannabis work for a firm, Aaron Fox Schiff, in Washington, D.C. We had done some work for helping local and state regulators draft medical ordinances and things like that. Once Prop 64 came into being in California, I relocated to the LA office for the firm and helped them grow the cannabis practice group. From there, I went in-house counsel with Steezy Shrine Group for 3 years and helped them grow in California and multiple other states on the West Coast. And now I've, since 2 years into starting my own practice, and largely represent cannabis clients, probably 80% of the work that I do, from family offices to brands to multi-state operators and a variety of different interested parties, investors, and operators in the space. And have had the benefit of seeing a lot of different functions and pieces of this industry and learned a lot along the way, and happy to share that knowledge with other people to help all ships rise in a rising tide. So the more people can get their things in order and grow their businesses, I think it's good for everyone in the industry. So we'll go from there.
Awesome. Well, I know I have a question to kick things off.
Okay.
Maybe this is kind of a big one, but I'm just wondering what your take is on the current kind of state of the cannabis industry in California right now.
Yeah, so I think in California, what you're seeing a lot of is the people with experience that have been through some of the challenging ups and downs in industry, that are really understanding how to evaluate business deals and find ways to make money, are the ones that are thriving. I know that's a relative term, but there are quite a few success stories in California, despite the doom and gloom outlook. It's certainly a highly regulated and highly taxed jurisdiction. It's not easy to make a lot of money or be very nimble. A lot of people have gone out of business, but I think that's somewhat to be expected with the sort of green rush that happened, of everyone thinking they could just come in and everyone would be successful. Market competition eventually creates, a really good sort of knockoff system for people that don't really know what they're doing or have good systems in place. I think in California specifically, having some aspect of vertical integration is really important, where you don't just rely on one aspect of the business to make money. As an example, if you're a small retailer, you might not be doing that well, but if you add white label products or your own brands, even if you're not growing them yourselves, you can capture a lot higher of the margin on the product you're selling. So in some sense, either a vertical light or a full vertical integration. I see a lot of the success stories are people that had the fortune or wisdom to be in that sort of setup to start. Excuse me. And I think generally, California is a great lesson to be learned for any other state that people are doing business in, because the markets will contract, prices will come down. There will be, a sort of race to the bottom on the value and price process for different products in the dispensaries. And so you got to build your model on what's coming and not necessarily what you think is happening right at the moment. And we've seen in Michigan and other states where once competition really saturates, you really got to have your SOPs and your financial projections based on what's coming and what the prices will settle at to really long-term sustain in the industry. California is challenging, but I do think there's still some opportunities for people that know how to evaluate deals correctly and get the right types of licenses in the right areas.
Awesome. And John, a lot of people are either, still considering getting into the industry, or they're looking, to expand. What would you say would be some of like the unique challenges in California?
In California, there's a couple of things that are really important. Differentiation is really important in cannabis, and it's very difficult for a lot of people. Although you have growers and product developers that have their own unique versions, by and large, most of the product is the same once you reach certain thresholds of quality. So if you are getting into the industry and you have something novel or something that has a differentiation about it, you will have a relatively easier time maybe getting some traction in. If you're trying to offer the same thing as everybody else and compete on price and other things, what's going to make me buy your product versus somebody else's? Or as a dispensary or a buyer for a dispensary, what's going to make me carry your product versus my own brand or some other brand that's already on the shelf? So getting into stores and finding a way to break through, in my opinion, really takes some differentiation or a value proposition that nobody else is offering. I think you should always make sure you have more money than you think you're going to need across the board, from regulations and experts and taxes and all the other things that go into running a business. It's just going to be magnified given that there's a lot of uncertainty in some of the California markets. You have people that can't collect invoices from retailers and other things. So there's always going to be a need to have cash reserves, especially in this type of a mature market. But just having really replicable systems in place, I think, is important if you're going to have any type of scale as a business. If you're a one-off retail store and you're, doing decent business, or maybe you have some, white labeling, that's probably fine. But if you want to grow into a multi-store chain or do something like that, you really got to iron out the kinks very well to make sure that that system is scalable and replicable, or else you're just going to be carrying mistakes from one place to another, and it's going to lead to a lot of headache and, costs that you aren't really anticipating.
That kind of leads into the submitted question. So this one is, how can I stay updated on changes in cannabis regulations and ensure ongoing compliance for my dispensary?
Yeah, so like for updated regulations, even being in the space as a legal counsel, I rely on a lot of literature that's sort of already out there as far as people that are summarizing state legislator bills and things like that. There's plenty of resources. I mean, I hate to be so simple to say Google, but if you search for people, lobbyists and other groups are constantly doing rundowns of what's in session, what's likely to pass, and what's coming down. Although heavy reading can be sort of part of looking at the regulations, I do think, for all of its faults, California's regulations are pretty straightforward and accessible. They're easily codified, and you can really go to them and really understand whether it's advertising or labeling or packaging, ownership disclosures. It's pretty straightforward. So the big thing is it's sort of anticipating new changes and looking at the legislative sessions and seeing what's coming down from a regulation standpoint. As an example, I know last year through the House and Senate, they passed allowing retail stores to sell non-cannabis food items, but then the governor vetoed that unexpectedly at the last minute. So that would have been a huge change. That would have really been, I think, a boost to sales for retailers. I do think that they're going to try again for those types of things this year, and having that sort of pulse on the bills that are coming down is the best way to sort of stay informed about what you may or may not need to plan for in the future. Sort of have a plan. If it doesn't pass, have a backup plan to pivot the other direction, I think is important. And then really asking around the industry and looking at best practices. I think it's really important for retailers to visit other people's stores, see what's working, look up data metrics and see who's doing really well with certain product SKUs and other things to really understand what are you buying? What are you stocking? What do you have in your store? To really anticipate and stay on top of trends that are taking place, because if you're slow to adapt, your customers are going to find other places to go to find what's actually out there that they're looking for.
Awesome. That's very helpful. Thanks. And staying on that same theme of compliance, what are the issues that you're finding just in particular to labor compliance that a lot of the dispensaries are facing?
Yeah, I think in California specifically, it can be a very challenging labor market, just due to the fact that they have a lot of employee-friendly laws that are in place for good reason, you know, making sure employees are protected. Some of the details on how to stay in compliance with that, I always tell my clients, just having enough experience as general counsel in a variety of capacities, but dealing with a lot of labor issues in California. If you are not proactively documenting things, even if you're doing it right and it's not a clear documented record of what's going on, you're going to be seen as not being in compliance. I know that's like a heavy burden to bear, but if a court comes in a case or there's something going on and you can't clearly show records detailing all of your processes, there's going to be an assumption that you're doing something wrong. And so having some type of system in place where, you know, the major ones I see often fall under what are called PAGA type claims. And it's basically, PAGA is a statute that allows individuals to bring claims on behalf of the Attorney General in the state of California. So it's like the Attorney General is too busy, so he's going to allow ordinary citizens to sue on their behalf for labor violations. And so those typically reach into class action lawsuits over things like meal and rest breaks, improper overtime, not paying overtime, looking at things like time off and scheduling, anything that's sort of like the regular statutory stuff that you're required to do. The likely analysis is if you're not doing it for one person, you're probably not doing it for a lot of people. And so those PAGA claims can really crippling to the company. We certainly were no stranger to having those complaints levered in or lodged in our way when I was at Steezy Shrine Group, but it can be pretty tricky. Even if you think you're doing everything right, even if you've fixed problems you had in the past, there can be sort of what's called statute of limitations period where they can look back, and even if you were doing it wrong in the past and you fixed it, they can still go after you for some of those prior violations. I think it's a 4-year look back period. So, you know, even if you've changed the rules and gotten your stuff in order, there can still be some liability there. Now, the benefit to PAGA claims is once you sort of resolve them or settle them, it's sort of closing the ecosystem. As long as you're good going forward, you should be sort of settling everything that happened in the past. But it can easily get in the millions of dollars range for penalties for not paying correct overtime or not paying correctly on meal and rest breaks. Those are the big ones, is meal and rest breaks and overtime in sort of improper classification, all sorts of things that are easy, but with higher number of employees and volume, it just gets hard to manage. And, you know, did somebody take a break? Did they clock out at the right time? Did you follow up and flag it? Did you go back and correct the punch? All of these things lead to just a mess. And, you know, to be honest, it's one of the reasons why I enjoy working with you guys at Kai Push, because you have systems in place. I remember the first time I looked at the demo of what you guys are doing, I was like, I wish I had this, you know, when I was in-house, because it streamlines a lot of that compliance to where it's all on a dashboard in front of you and you don't really have to ask questions. And to my first point, it's documented. There's a record of it. You can go and pull data. You can run reports in a way where, you know, if something's going wrong, it's really on you of making a big mistake rather than not having the systems to catch the errors. And so I think having a system in place is really important, because they're not major violations in most cases. You know, like claims related to like hostile workplace or individual claims, those can be costly, but they're not as detrimental as like the class action for large scale wage and labor violations. And so that's like a low hanging fruit that can cripple your business, but it's not really hard to fix. It's just about having good systems in place.
Awesome, that's great. I'm guessing kind of having those systems in place is kind of the answer to this question, but what's your kind of one piece of advice for a dispensary owner who's looking to expand from one location to multiple locations?
Yeah, you know, you sort of alluded to it, is having systems in place. making sure you're poking holes and not thinking that your system's foolproof, and looking at other stores, seeing what people are doing right, and really dialing in SOPs and training materials to make sure that you are keeping it consistent across the board. A lot of people probably try to scale before they're ready to, or before they've really dialed in what their training program looks like, what their management training looks like, what their, SOPs for stocking and all these other things. As you continue to grow and you're managing more responsibilities with less people, you really got to dial things in from like this is streamlined. Otherwise, you're going to be running around putting out fires and then distracting from the core business of growth and revenue and other things. I know that one of the things that lets Steezy stand out is their SOPs and their processes are very dialed in. Every store, the experience is very similar. You know what to expect when you're going to one of those stores. They've scaled over 32 locations for a reason, and they've done it without really having a ton of hiccups, but they had their learning experiences over time, and it really takes ironing it out through that process. But the quicker you can do that with one store and learn from other people, I think the better. But having complete systems in place is the number one thing if you're scaling.
And like, we're in the industry, and I think for us it's a challenge always to stay on top of all the changes. And I think you alluded earlier about how you stay on top of the changes. Any advice for just a dispensary owner that's busy running a store? Like, what's the best way for them to stay compliant and stay in touch with all the changes? Because it's as you know, the space is evolving so quickly.
Yeah, I mean, as I noted, because we're sort of getting into the season of cannabis in California, it's not brand new anymore. I don't think there's going to be very many real quick changes that you have to adapt to suddenly. I think the regulatory process goes through rulemaking or proposed changes, so you'll likely have enough of a heads up where you won't have to pivot like on a moment's notice. I think following literature, blogs, people that write about the compliance and other side of the industry is probably the easiest way, and finding resources or people that have regular communications on those things. To me, the most helpful, like I said, is following the legislative updates and see what's coming down. Again, those take a year to get passed and processed most times, so you have enough time to plan and sort of work around those. And again, really understanding the compliance rules is, I think, essential. Making sure you have the right people in place to help audit and implement those rules is also really important. You can know what you're doing, but not actually follow through and make sure you're doing it. And so having a really strong compliance and audit team. I also know there's some really good third-party providers that do compliance and auditing work for relatively reasonable fees that aren't too much, and you could do it once or twice a year. They can come in and audit your systems, look at your inventory, and help you do stuff with metric compliance and all sorts of things like that. To me, that's money well spent. You could be looking at like $2,000 to $5,000 for a contract for somebody to come in and audit your entire system and poke holes in it. And I think that's money well spent if you're making sure that you're about to grow, or that you really want to make sure that you have your systems dialed in and that you're not overlooking any gaps from a compliance standpoint.
That makes a lot of sense. Pivoting a little bit to answer this question. So, how do you see hemp impacting the cannabis industry? And then kind of the same thing, but also with like things like Delta-9.
Yeah, I've, on LinkedIn, I sort of poke fun at this issue a lot because there's a lot of strong opinions, and sometimes it's just fun to have a good conversation about it. It's certainly impacting the industry from the pure regulated cannabis side. Whether it's a good or bad thing, I think it depends on how many licenses you hold and what your opinion is of cannabis deregulation. As long as people are operating in compliance with the law, and people want to call it a loophole, it's not a loophole. You're just taking advantage of the law as it's written right now. It allows for interstate commerce for hemp, and whether or not it's properly classified as hemp is another question. There's a lot of people that are exploiting the lack of knowledge in that area. But I do think over the next 12 months anyway, before any major changes to the Farm Bill, you're going to see a lot of money made in hemp that is diluting and eating into licensed cannabis sales. And there's sort of a tug back and forth on that topic. my advice to cannabis brands and license holders is have a hemp plan. If it goes away through regulation, you need to pivot back to purely licensed, regulated cannabis, and so be it. But there's enough money out there right now, and there's enough clear legal analysis that it is a marketplace that can be entered into. There's conflicting rulings, and a lot of times none of this gets really settled until there's case law on it. So it's going to take the DEA or somebody, enforcing or doing something and then them appealing. So it's kind of the Wild West all over again, where, who knows if a synthetic derivative from CBD is permissible. The DEA said it's not, but are they really enforcing that? And is that really how the Farm Bill reads? Because it says all derivatives, and other things. So there's a lot of uncertainty there. And if you have an appetite for risk, which I think most people in cannabis do, otherwise they wouldn't be in it. I always think it's funny how people that are in cannabis, and hemp is cannabis, but that are in cannabis looking at hemp saying, well, you're not following the rules, when cannabis is already federally illegal and you're not following the rules either. It's just not following as you are doing. So it's kind of funny to hear those arguments. And, I think there's a lot of gray area for opportunity, not for risk aversion in that sense. The one thing I don't think people realize is products liability. A lot of hemp operators have no experience of running real CPG businesses. And if you're putting stuff out there that's misleading or not labeled properly, and they can find you, you're going to be potentially subject to huge lawsuits for, this said hemp, but I failed a drug test. Why is that the case? You didn't have proper disclosure on your packaging, letting me know that if I ignite this, then it turns to Delta-9. A lot of the Delta-9 stuff out there is CBD that's converted synthetically. There is some state law that's written where the flower they test is only for Delta-9, not total THC, which includes THCA, the precursor to Delta-9. So it's sort of a state-by-state framework, depending on what they have in place. The USDA has been pretty clear that they interpret it to be total THC. Again, the hemp law doesn't say total THC, so it's kind of like regulators saying, well, this is what it means. And again, not until a court gets involved are you really going to have clarity on that. So I advise my clients have a hemp strategy. There's certainly a marketplace for it, and you could dwarf your cannabis revenue in 12 months by taking that path. As long as you're doing it with compliant chains of custody and certificates testing the product, there's no reason why you shouldn't be doing both, but just being cautious and making sure you're being prudent about how you're doing it and have a plan to pivot back if it ends up getting taken away. But there's certainly opportunity in the short term to be looking at that as a viable option to make some money.
That's great advice. And companies, a lot of, there's a trend of a lot of companies looking to vertically integrate. What's like legal advice would you give them?
So it's the tough thing is about vertical integration is the cost, especially in cultivation. In immature markets, it can be very worthwhile to spend a good amount of money to have a big scale cultivation to be able to feed the need over time. I find the best approach is to have space to scale into if you need it, but only develop it out in phases. The vertical integration is a key component, but as markets mature, things like cultivation, you look in California, if you were going to start building a brand new grow right now, you'd probably be called crazy. There's so much flower in the state, and you can buy pounds for so cheap that if you're doing it for the purpose of packaging it in your own bags and selling it, it's not worth the $15 million outlay to build out a 50,000 square foot grow facility. In less mature markets where there's probably 2 to 5 years before that really happens, or there's limited licenses available, it's certainly really attractive and important, but you're just going to need a decent amount of money to get anything of meaningful size, especially on the cultivation side, up and running. I do think it's important to control your own destiny in cannabis, but the fear that I have is as the hemp regulations and other things start to deregulate a little bit, you're going to be sitting on all this infrastructure that now doesn't have all the same restrictions, and your recapture on your investment is going to take a long time because the market is now a free-for-all. I do see that as a potential with hemp, where maybe they liberalize it even more as a backdoor to legalization federally, and now you're competing in a regulated market with people that don't have any of those restrictions. It becomes very challenging. So I think patience is important. starting with what you're good at, getting a product or something that you can really dial in. Don't try to be everything to everybody. Grow incrementally over time and just manage your costs really effectively. I would shoot for profitability before I would be concerned with top line revenue, and put a system in place that you can incrementally scale and find a really just good business model, and then add on as you need the capacity demand.
Great advice. Thank you.
These are all such good insights. I feel like I could just sit here and ask you questions forever. But we are at our 30-minute mark now. Before we go, John, I just was wondering if you wanted to share to everyone ways that they can connect with you.
Yeah. I first mentioned I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, and just providing useful information to people to the best extent that I can, and add value to people that way. I have my own law firm. My email address is john@jmalone.law. That's a pretty direct way to reach me. Yeah, and on my website at jmalone.law as well. There's some information about my practice areas and the different types of things that I work on. And outside of cannabis, I mainly do real estate transactions and general corporate stuff on the business and legal side there. But yeah, LinkedIn direct messages or my email is probably the best way to get in touch with me, and always happy to connect. And, I think I'll differentiate myself a little bit. Unlike most lawyers, I focus on building relationships first, not just billing people. And so if there's ways that I can add value or understand a client's business needs or model, and add value before you got to pay for it, that's something I'm really interested in, to help find relationships of companies that are going to be successful and helping them get to that space. And it's sort of the luxury of being a solo practitioner, where I have a good client base and can really look at the relationships I want to build instead of just chasing invoices and other things like that. So I really enjoy meeting people and understand what their goals are, and figuring out if I can't add value, is there somebody I can introduce you to, or make a connection to a vendor like you guys, other things. And I know it's shameless plug and promotion, but networking and opportunities with vendors that I think are really high quality, like Kaya Push and others, it really helps just build an ecosystem to where our clients can rely on expertise. And I think if they build that trust with the people and network and professionals that are here to help, that's sort of, again, a really good avenue to meet people, is find good professionals that you like and see who they would recommend. Because that can go a really long way in helping the vetting process and not have to have headaches and bad clients and bad customer service. So that's sort of my final spiel on that part. But yeah, I appreciate the questions.
Awesome. And I mean, there's a reason we partnered with you, and it's because, your ideologies fit ours, and we also just want to offer value, and we know that you can offer a ton of value. So we really appreciate you being here today. Thank you to everyone who joined. We'll be back here next week at the same time with our next guest, who is going to be Wesley. He is the president of the Cannabis Distributors Association in California. So we'll see everyone then. Thank you so much. Thanks again,
John.
John.
Appreciate it.
Have a great day, guys. Thanks.
Bye.